All right, well, I thank you folks for coming over today. My name is Greg Gorton, for those of you I haven't met yet. Just a little background on myself. I'm a retired naval officer. I fought the horological bug about 15 years ago. And in the last 10 years, American perpetual calendar clocks is kind of the niche what I've been researching and studying and collecting. And so today, I'm going to be talking about the bit of history on the Seth Thomas line of office calendars. Just a quick definition. So when I say a perpetual calendar clock, what I mean is that it corrects for leap year every fourth year with a mechanical movement. Now there's different tiers of perpetual. The next level is every 100 years is not a leap year. So these clocks, they're not smart enough to go, okay, every 100 years we don't correct a leap year. And I remember seeing articles in the papers in the year 1900 caused a little bit of a hiccup because everybody who had their perpetual calendars thought they would be right, but they weren't right. And so they had to adjust for them. At any time, if you have a question, please just stop and ask me. I'd be glad to help. And also, this is always a work in progress. Every time I think I know everything about a certain subject, I meet somebody that teaches me something new. So I'm always open to any ideas or something you've seen or suggestions. So let's get started. This is Old Man Seth. Some of you have probably seen the picture before. I'm going to start my talk in the year of 1853. Seth Thomas is 67 years old at this time. He's still running the Seth Thomas clock company. He owns numerous land holdings in Plymouth Hollow. He owns a brass rolling mill, a cotton factory, and a clock factory in Plymouth Hollow, Connecticut. He's just organized his brass rolling mill as a joint stock company, and he follows that up with his clock company. It's a family-owned business. About 75% of the stock is owned by Seth and his immediate family. He makes himself president. His middle son, Edward, is the secretary and treasurer. And the other directors, again, are all family members. Usually it ends up being son-in-laws married to his daughters that make up the rest of it. Seth Thomas, you know a bit about the history, was a person who was pretty conservative. He stuck to a conservative line of clocks. He would let other people kind of try things out, see how they did before he would switch over as his business. In 1853, which we're looking at is inventories on May 3rd, when he was incorporating the company. In the top line, you'll see there's 5,055 of 30-hour weight movements that are finished. And he has 8,000 30-hour weight movements that are in process. So he was still primarily, his line of clocks were weight-driven 30-hour movements that he was selling in the company in 1853. They had just started doing some spring movements, which you can see on there. You're talking like he has 81 8-day spring, and 233 of 30-hour spring movements that they had in the factory at that time. So also in 1853, the first U.S. patent for a calendar clock mechanism was granted to John Hawes of Ithaca, New York. If you have a copy of Joel Warren's book on the Ithaca calendar clock history, on this mechanism, it didn't correct for a leap year, but he wrote how he could, make a change on what he had put in the patent model, so it would correct for leap year. So he explained what the additional CAM would be needed to do so. So an interesting thing that I actually found out pretty recently is when you do the history of the Ithaca calendar clocks, you'll see soon after Aikens and Burritt in Ithaca, which we'll come to in a second, would then go out with their patent with the corrections for leap year. And we didn't hear what happened to John Hawes. Well, what I found in the Hartford Current, looking through some of the old papers, that he was going to with a couple investments. And so what you see in the article, see if I can get the pointer here. Here's your pointer. So this, that come up, it did not. So the Ithaca was advertising that Mr. Hawes with a couple of investors from Ithaca were going to start producing perpetual calendar clocks and selling them at the market for them. But if you look, this was actually a clipping in the Hartford Courant. We're here at the bottom, you will see it says, "Well, we are pleased to learn that Mr. Hawes is now in Hartford and that he's making arrangements to manufacture his calendar clocks here in Connecticut, not in Ithaca." They did run an advertisement or a notice a little later that they were going to have the first meeting of stockholders for the Hawes Calendar Clock Company. If you read the top, you'll see they called it Flock Company with a misprint. This is the only thing I've seen. I've never seen any clocks or any other history that I've come across doing my research that they ever did manufacture clocks and that it did come to fruition. So if we jump back to Ithaca, Akins and Burr did have patents in 1854 and 1857 that were improving upon the Hawes patent. And this was a perpetual calendar mechanism. This is a picture from a clock that I had an opportunity to overhaul and restore for a gentleman. This is the mechanism that was in the Akins patent, the second patent, and this is a Mix Brothers movement that's on top. This one was number 6, so they were making movements with the time and the calendar movements. And it was dated 1854. So I only know of one extant clock this was cased in. I do not know of others, but they did make some in Ithaca at the time. This was soon followed by the Mix brothers, Eugene and James Mix. They continued to improve upon that calendar mechanism. If you notice, looking at the picture, this thing is pretty big. It's bulky, it's heavy. The frame that the calendar mechanism is in. You'll see that the month roller and the day rollers different size. And the reason I bring this up, if you're starting to think you're going to manufacture these, you need to make it smaller, you need to make it lighter, you need to make some of the parts, that you can reuse for multiple purposes. And this is what the Mix brothers did in their patents. So they started making it so some of the parts were the same, the rollers were the same size, made it a much smaller package and a lighter package for manufacturing. So they had their 2 patents in 1860 and 62. And these patents, the previous ones from Akins and Burr, and then these from the Mix brothers were assigned to 2 gentlemen. They were investors, Wade Huntington and Herbie Platts out of Ithaca, New York. So I'm going to jump back to the Seth Thomas Clock Company now. And on January 28, 1859, Seth Thomas dies at the age of 73. Aaron Thomas, the youngest of his 3 sons, took over as president of the company 11 days before his father passed away. Edward Thomas, the middle brother, continues as a secretary and treasurer. The Seth Thomas Clock Company would quickly change with the addition of many new models. So once Dad had passed away and the sons took over, they were much less doing the conservative line of things. They were open to bringing in other different types and models and expanding. They were soon about to get a visit from Huntington and Platts. So on November 22nd, 1859, Wade Huntington and Herbie Platts grant the exclusive rights to manufacture calendar clocks based on the Akins and Burr patents and the patents pending that are coming from the Mix brothers. And they bring a model with them to the Seth Thomas Clock Company. And in the agreement, they said the Seth Thomas Clock Company will begin manufacture with all practical diligence of various models for the benefit of both parties. Huntington and Platts will receive 25 cents for each clock that is made and marketed, but not less than 12.5 cents in the future. And the agreement was signed by Huntington, Platts, and Edward Thomas for the Seth Thomas Clock Company. In my research, another thing that I tripped across was there looks like there might have been some problems with the agreement. So less than a year later, in October 11th, 1860, I found this basis of settlement. And it said that Huntington and Platts, by way of compensation for damages, to receive the 200 cases now in the process of manufacture, well finished, within 3 months from this date, with all the dies and punches and all the pieces pressed out for the 2 sizes of calendars, and all the calendar clocks that may be on hand completed or patterns in said part of this clock. And this proposition is ready for settlement, and if not accepted, there was no way to bind Huntington and Platts. I do not know if this was ever given to the Seth Thomas Clock Company. If it was, what I do know, nothing showed up in the minute books of the board, and they never slowed down producing their calendar clocks. So either they came to a settlement or this was never given to Huntington and Platts. So these are pages from the earliest catalog that I'm aware of. Seth Thomas catalog dated 1863. At this time, they had added 3 regulator clocks to their line, and they were promoting their calendar clocks, of which they say several thousand are running in all parts of the world. And it says at this point, they were the sole owners of the patents under which they are manufacturing these calendars. And they're prepared to put them up with months and days of the week in French and Spanish. So there's a transition point here. So when you're dating the clocks, first 1860, 61, maybe 62, they had the license agreement with Huntington and Platts. And I'll show some pictures. You'll see that on the labels that are on the clocks. Once they owned them outright, they no longer mentioned Huntington and Platts when they listed the patents on the labels. So we know by 1863, they were advertising they owned them outright. So it's commonly published that the Seth Thomas Clock Company had 3 calendar clock models when they started. And I believe the reason that they did so, if you look in Trans book on calendar clocks or the Miller and Miller books on the survey of calendar clocks, is all they had to go by was that 1863 catalog. When I was fortunate enough to be able to go through the minute books of the company, we found out they were actually, and it kind of lines up when they got the patent rights, by 1860, they were producing 4 different models. And so they had an inventory always in the minute books at the beginning of the year. You can see on January 1st of 1861, they just said 112 calendar clocks. So they weren't specific about models or types. And then how many of the small and large movements they had. But in 1862, in the inventory, they had 9 number 1s, which is going to be the office calendar number 1, 17 number 2s, 112 parlors, and 105 rose gilt calendar clocks. So what was the rose gilt calendar clock that they were manufacturing the first couple of years? So this was their rose gilt calendar model. It was a shelf model. Some of you are probably very familiar with it, but it's the case that they used their Empire case, and they sold this as a column clock with gold gilding, or they called it a shell, or just a veneer. They made this, but at the time they had their 1863 catalog, they were no longer producing or selling this model. So I don't know whether they did it for 2 years or 3 years, but it was no longer produced by that time. The label, if you see the picture on this one, see how we'll say it's under patents granted to Huntington and Platts. So that would date it in that 1860, 61, maybe 62 time period. If you see Huntington and Platts listed on the label. So they would go on to manufacture parlor and shelf clocks for the next 70 plus years. But today we're just going to talk about their office calendars, the wall-hanging clocks. The handout that I gave you is, you're going to see a lot of these slides, just what's on there. So I'm not going to read everything down the columns. You've got that on there. I pulled all the information going through the catalogs. So as far as, what woods were used, when they switched over, when they did time, and then time and strike, and so forth. And that'll all be in the handout, so we don't have to go through those specific details. The office calendar number 1 was offered for about 24 years. They're actually quite common. I see them in auctions very often. Regionals, you'll see them. And of course, they started out using what I'll call it the Mix Brothers movement as we go through the talk, which is the first movement, And I've got a clock here today of the 2 different movements, so I can show you what some of the differences were and why they changed them when we get them. This is a model that came with an OG and a double OG case. I have another picture where I show the 2 next to each other so you can see what the difference is. Of course, here, usually what you would expect to see in the dial on these is, again, see the 4 patent dates that they had for the Akins and Bird patents, and then Mix Brothers patents that they acquired. You should also see the label that would be inside the clock, usually inside the door, and the patent state should match what's on the dial. Could there be an instance where there might be a slight difference, like they have the 3 or the 2? I wouldn't want to see that, but you could make the arguments sometimes, right? They're not going to throw anything away. They're making thousands of these. They don't just do a dial at a time for the clock. I could see where you'd have an overlap sometime with movements or with the dials, where we're going to finish using these up before we switch to the new ones. So one thing I learned years ago is never say never. Because you can get stuff that doesn't match up exactly right sometimes. The time movement that's in office calendar one, the pendulum rods in the front. I've seen some, this has two metal rods right here. Sometimes I see four, like a pair of two rods on one side, two on the other. I don't know if that helps date them or something like that, but I've seen them done both ways. Motion works on the outside, it has a technique escapement with steel cut pinions, and it has a compounded weight. This is the standard Mix Brothers movement. This is the large version. It came in the small and the large version. The number one off this calendar had the large version in that. This is from an 1879 catalog. By this time, they had the newer RT Andrews movement, which I'll come to in a few minutes. So the number one did, go in production and switch to the different calendar movements as they updated. And as I mentioned, they came in a single and double OG. So the double OG one is on the right, and it's on the side. You can see instead of just running smoothly to the back around, it kind of goes down and does a second left. So it's a little bit fancier. Usually what I find over at Evolution at times, they don't get fancier as they get older. They get not as fancy because it's easier to manufacture and so forth. Always a way to kind of try to save some money. Notice that this calendar dial is going to have the Randall T. Andrews movement in it, which I'll come to talk about. It says patented February 15th, 1876 on the dial. And this is what we'll find in the later models, and like I said, when we come to Randall T. Andrews. The office calendar number 2, it was introduced at about the same time as the number 1. It was in the catalog of 1863, and it was in production for about 19 years. This clock used some unique hands. If you see the hands that are there on the time dial, I had not seen these or of any other of the office calendar clock models. I have a picture here of one that belonged to Leon Richmond, and on the time side, you can see the unique hands that they use. This one that you see on the calendar side has a kind of traditional hand well used to see in any of the double dial calendar clocks. I don't know if it's standard and switched or if originally it had one of the unique hands. Again, noticing the patent dates on this, it only has 3 patents, not the 4th one from 1862 yet. And if we look at the labels, the label should match up. And if you look at the very bottom, it might be a little hard to read under here, patents ran into Huntington and Platts again. So it dates the clock in that 1860, 1862 time period. Just one thing, this clock is huge. Most people are kind of used to the parlor number 3. It's about this tall. This is basically a parlor number 3 on steroids. You can see it hanging in the American Clock Museum on the right side, next to an Ingram calendar, and it's significantly larger. I never really understood the appeal of this clock. It's a big box clock. The next office calendar model it came out with was the number 3. Most collectors, recognize this as a peanut, is what people called it. I did bring one in today. I don't know, I didn't have access to the 1870 or 72 catalog to verify that there was the date it was discontinued. But I pulled this information from Chris Bailey's reprint of some earlier catalogs that he had. Here's pictures of the 3 different peanuts that I had an opportunity to look at one time. Carol Gorton and Leon Richmond were again nice enough when I was doing my research back in 2012, 2013 to let me go in, take their clocks, put them on the floor, pull the dials in the hands, and take pictures of the movements. So again, on these clocks, if you see the dial, they only have the 3 patent dates on it. That's not right. It should have the 4 patent dates on the dial, because by the time they came out with this, they owned the patent rights out. So you should see all 4 patent dates. This one has the S&T hands, which you saw in some of their clocks they put it on, and the number 3 was the only office calendar used at S&T hands for South Thomas. Again, you should see all the 4 patents listed. If you look at a label that's on number 3, and that's what should match up with what you would see on a dial on number 3. The number three had a unique movement. I'm not familiar, maybe somebody here would know if they used this movement in any other just regular time clocks. I believe it was only used here in the number three. It's a time only movement. You can see it with two springs. It has an outside recoil escapement. And again, it uses the Mix Brothers movement, as I call it, the smaller version of the Mix Brothers movement. The next one that came out was the office calendar number 4. Tran shows this in his catalog with a date of 1863. I think it was just a misprint. 63 was the first catalog that came out in 1868. And again, it started out with the Mix Brothers movement, but they added the production long enough that it would switch over. Because it was discontinued until 1879 to use the Art Andrews movement. They came in a time and strike model. They noticed the moon hands, I believe, they kind of start out with, I cannot call them moon hands, there might be another term for them, the picture that's on the right. Usually it was the earlier models. And then the one on the left, you can see that's our time only, again, just from the artists. And this is the movement that's in number 4. The same movement would be used in the number 6 and number 7 office calendars. So this was their time only movement. And again, the Mix Brothers small version of the calendar. This is the time and strike movement that they used a little later when they offered the time and strike. And again, it was used in the number 6 and number 7s also used the same movement. One thing I found a bit annoying about it is plate screws. Since they have the fly over here in the corner, they stuck the other plate screw for the top right under the escape. So if you talk about somebody nervous when it's kind of rusted and hard to loosen up and you're sticking a screwdriver inside between the escape wheel to try to open it up. I'm always trying to be really careful when I'm doing that. So the office calendar number 4 also using Andrews calendar movement. And so let's talk a little bit about Randall T. Andrews. So Seth Thomas's second wife was Laura Andrews, and her nephew Randall T. Andrews Sr. worked for the Seth Thomas Clock Company in the 1820s. He died young in 1830 before his son Randall T. Andrews Jr. was born. But Randall T. Andrews Jr. became a design engineer for the Seth Thomas Clock Company. He was granted 3 patents that he all assigned to the company, and the most famous one being his improved calendar mechanism, with a patent date of February 15, 1876. In 1878, the Seth Thomas Clock Company now has been under the leadership of Aaron Thomas for about 20 years. Their catalog was proud to advertise, the awards at the Centennial Exhibition for their tower clocks and the great variety of their brass lines. They were still advertising their calendar clocks, now offered in French, Spanish, German, Portuguese, and Russian. Also noticed something that I had learned is they use the term cheapest, but it's not has a negative connotation that it would have today. Because what they say in their advertisement, it says, "We do not intend or desire to offer the public clocks which shall be lower priced than those of our other makers. But we do intend in the future, as in the past, to produce clocks which, quality and durability considered, shall be the cheapest in the market." Just a clip, and they had catalogs were multilingual. This is one of the Seth Thomas catalogs advertising one of their clocks being offered at the time in time and strike versions in German and Spanish and French, along with English. This is also, I'd say I didn't have an 1876 catalog or price list to see if the office calendar number 6 was offered earlier in 1878, but the first I seen where it showed up was 1878. If you see a model, I had one, if you notice in this picture, the bezel that's running around the 2 dials, it's actually the wood bezel flat. And they only offered that for 1 or 2 years. So if you see one of those on a mark table or something, that would date it to being the first year or 2, 1878 or 1879 that they made that model. Here's a picture of one with the flat bezels around the outside, number 6. This one was dated 1878 on a lot of times they'll be penciled on some of the labels I've noticed in the clocks of when they set them up. So you'll have a month and a year that they set the clock up. And this one had August of 1878. Again, the time only movement that we saw previously in the number 4, the number 6. And in the next catalog, they changed the bezel style to it's more of a pointed edge that goes around the outside of the bezel on the front. And I see these much more frequently. There's a couple pictures of them, and the style, like I said, the wood bezel is different than what they did the first year. So again, it kind of helps you date one of these models when you're looking at it. This is the office calendar number 5. If you notice that on the case design, so this came out in the 1879 catalog, but it was in an 1878 price list. So that kind of made sense to me that since you numerically were going up, that the 5 probably would come out same time as the number 6, not a year after. So that did work out that way. If you notice in the catalog, they have this kind of fancy little, if you want to call it a fretwork or whatever, on the bottom on the front. I've only seen one out of about 10 of these plots that I've seen that actually the one on the right here you see has that. All the other ones that I've seen, or most of them, have this very smooth, they don't have that kind of fancy fretwork right on the front and the bottom. Again, I don't know if they did that the first year or 2 years, and then maybe they broke easy or something, or it just was simpler not to put it on there. Starting with the office calendar number 5, they went to the keystone movement, a heavy duty movement, time only. This same style movement would be used in the numbers 8, 9s, and 11s, which were going to be their second speed calendars. This was not a second speed calendar clock. It had its debut with 36 speeds. They would switch to one with 30 for the larger clocks when they came out with the larger office calendars. This is the Randall T. Andrews movement. So from this point forward, this is the movement they would always use. After the talk, I can come up and just show you what the issues were with the old one. What most people kind of know is whoever buys them. If you turn the clock sideways, the little locking levers kind of fall back, and then they can get hung up, and you got to pull the dial and you get the stuff. And the Randall T. Andrews movement, everything was fixed. But you could still move it with spring tension, but you could hold the clock upside down, right side up, hang it up, and the calendar mechanism was fine. I would never get confused. One thing I usually always notice on the brass frames for the movements, you usually always will see the patent February 15th, 1876 stamped on the brass movement. The number 5 also had a nice little viewing door on the bottom that you can open, a glass door with your key. But I found it kind of annoying. If you're looking at the clock, though, you really can't see anything. It's kind of up a little higher, and we don't see it through the glass door. The next model that came out was right after the number 6 was the number 7. It's just slightly smaller, very similar, design. This would be the longest running model of the office calendars. It was last shown in the 1913 catalog, and it was dropped in the 1916 price list. So they manufactured the number 7 for about 35 years. This came in a time and stripe, just like the number 6. There's an example, time and stripe on the left, where you can see the 2 arbors and the time only on the right. This is normally how you would see in like a number 6 or a number 7, how they would have the patent on the dial. Usually you'll see the patent, the RTN's patent on the dial, just like on the smaller clocks. Interesting one, this was a number 7 that was in Peru. Dan Haynes, a gentleman I met, the last 2 pictures I got from him, which he shared with me of his number 7 that was in Peru. And in the 1907 catalog, it's interesting, they changed the bezel to match the 6, but I've never seen a number 7 with the same thin bezel style. The number 6s are just round with bezel, kind of what you would see right here on the peanut up front, number 3. So in 1879, Seth Thomas was selling their large regulators, the 10, the 11, 12s, and 13. They had, defined floor models, and it was the same year they came out with the number 8 office calendar. For some folks, this is kind of their favorite of the office calendars, and some even call them the pagoda tops because of the top that they have on there. It only was in production for about 8 years. It only came in walnut, and it was their first second speed perpetual calendar clock. I did pull for the price list. You can see a couple of the prices for the clock in their price list from 1880 and 1888. The pearl walnut on the ones I've seen of these is very pretty. I think it's a very pretty clock. And this is the only model where I saw this particular style of the fancy way they put Seth Thomas on their office calendars. I think on some of the fancy regulators, they use a similar style, with all the flourishes that you see here on the side. Again, with the keystone movement, similar to the number 5, with a 32 escape wheel to facilitate the second speed pendulum. And Joel, when you were talking, the number 8 that I have, I think this was done after the fact. It might be a little fuzzy in the picture, but it actually has dual pallets on it from the 50s statement of the pallets. Nickel plated damascene bob, which you see quite often on some office calendars and some of the other Seth Thomas clocks. And at least this time, when they put another door with a viewing window on the bottom of the clock that you can open, and again with your key, you can see the pendulum bob swinging back and forth when the clock is running. The next model they came out with was the office calendar number 9. It showed up in 1881 price list, again offered for about 25 years. And this is the first model where I started noticing they were sharing the same cases as the regulators. So those you're familiar with the Seth Thomas regulators, the number 17 regulator, the number 9 office calendar use the same case. This is a picture of one of Carol Horton's auctions back in the 2009 auction catalog of that model. They did change the model slightly. If you notice, if you're looking at, they had the 2 separate panels that came off for the 2 dials. And then you can see here they went with a little different lower panel. In the 1890 catalog is where they saw that, where they made that change. And this was dropped in 1906 as a model. So a quick horological quiz for my friends out here in the audience. Can people tell me what happened in horological history in November 1883? Any guesses? A lot of clocks were changed. 12 noon, Eastern Standard Time, 20,000 station clocks, over 300,000 employee watches were all set simultaneously went from 53 different time systems to 4 time zones. So that was the date when we switched to time zones that we have today, 4 different time zones across the country. So in 1883 was also when they came out with the office calendar number 10. This model shares the same case style as the regulator number 6, if you're familiar with it, which came in a time and double time. And they offered this for about 26 years. Interesting, Tran mentions that the 1882 model had a convex bottom. So you were talking about, if you look here at the bottom of this number 6, how it's just, I have never seen an office calendar number 10 with that shaped bottom piece underneath. I've always seen them with, this style here, where it's concave coming down through the bottom. And they had 2 different styles. You see there's the one on the left, which is the older version, and then the one on the right, which is the newer version, which showed up in their 1890 catalog. So they kind of raised the calendar dial, lowered the pendulum a bit, and this is the model that they ran later as the newer model. And there's a picture of the older model on the left. It's an 1886 date, and then the newer model on the right, which would make it post 1890 when they came out with that style. The number 10 movement, again, has slanted pinions. Motion works on the inside of the plates, and it uses a compounded weight also, like the number 1 office calendar did. And then the typical, instructions and directions for the clock. One thing that I will talk about, if you read it on if your calendar gets out, you need to rotate through the dial to move the roller. They say, take the point of the knife to advance the calendar day and month goals. So I was hoping they wouldn't do that too often, and every time you keep poking it with a knife in those paper rollers to advance them. I find that nice clean eraser works much easier, and it's a little less destructive. Another nickel plated pendulum bob in number 10. And those of you familiar, they're very famous. At some point, they realized they had to tell people, do not oil these counter movements. You should not oil them because the oil obviously over time kind of gets gooey and sticky and then they don't operate correctly. And I've had quite a few where I had to take them up totally apart and then clean them. And there's people with, whether it was oil or WD-40 or something, making it work a little bit better. It's now 1884. The Seth Thomas Clock Company is still proud of their calendar clocks and their catalogs advertising them. And they're about to introduce their largest and most prestigious model, and it's also my favorite model. It is the peak of the Gilded Age. Big return of large Hall case or grandfather clocks. Walter Durfee makes a large ornate Hall clock that sells for $500 in 1887. Seth Thomas has sailed offices now in New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and London. And they've come out with their office calendar number 11. It's their third and the last of their second speed calendar movements. And it's also their most expensive. You can see up there, the order it was $112.50. And this is how it appeared in the 1884 catalog. They would make this clock for about 24 years. And it would be offered in walnut, cherry, mahogany, oak, and old oak, which I think is more than any other of the office calendars as far as you had to be able to order them, which would like to have. The one on the left is a walnut example, and the one on the right is oak. All the top carvings I've seen about a dozen. They're all a little bit different. So it's not like, oh, it's, because again, they were hand carved, I mean, it's flourishes, flowers, so forth, with leaves, they're all a little bit different. And then the front fretwork, there's three different styles that I've seen. The one at the top you can see is just cut fretwork, there's no relief, no carving done. That matches what they showed in the catalog when they first came out. So I think those, my guess is they were earlier, and then they decided that make it a little fancier. And the two different, just the middle, I've only seen two other styles, and that's kind of an example in the middle. So I did an article in the Bulletin in June of 2013 just on this model clock. So if you ever had any more interest in learning more about the office calendar number 11, I have a lot of details that are in there. This is what you would find on any of the larger calendar, the way they would put the patent date. And I've looked at several of these and they are identical. So at some point, I remember talking to Martha Smallwood, if you're familiar with Martha and the Dial House. And so they have, been able to print these out. And she said at some point, they switched early on, they were painting dials, but they did switch at some point to printing. And again, from a manufacturing perspective, it was faster, easier. And because if these are all hand painted, you'd be, slight minor variations. But if you look overlay some of these, you'll see they're the same. They were printed. And the number 11, interestingly enough, usually they're stamped on the bottom of the weight. You'll see this has the number 11, and then it has office CAL for calendar on the bottom of the weight. In the 1883, Seth Thomas introduced a calendar version of the drop octagon office clock. Since Seth Thomas has been selling calendar clocks, because that's what they call them, they were all perpetual. But a lot of the other companies are doing simple calendars, which I think most of us are familiar with. You see 31 days around the outside of the dial, and has a little star wheel behind it. At the end of the month, if it's not a 31-day month, you got to advance it to the first, and then it would work again. So they came out with one of those. Well, I think they got in trouble with some of their customers because in 1886 they put in the front, they're still proud of their calendar clocks, but oh, by the way, our drop octagon calendar is not perpetual. And I think people were buying them thinking they were, and they were not. And so this is just a picture of, the drop octagon calendar, which was just a simple calendar clock. My battery is running. Oh, it's going to make me speed up. Yeah, I don't want to lose the microphone when they're over here. Give me the plug. No stop. Sorry for the interruption. Okay. So the telegraph system was used to dispatch trains in about 1851, the year Western Union was started. By 1861, Western Union had built its first transcontinental telegraph system. By the 1880s, the postal telegraph system was in place. And telegraphs were used extensively for communications. Not only was Seth Thomas and other Waterbury, New Haven, they come out with these telegraph code lists. So you have price lists that would come out and the telegraph codes. So what it would allow you to do is if I wanted this clock, you know, with these options or with this style or this, all you had to put in this word, a code word. But you paid by how many characters or how many words you get when you send a telegraph. So if you looked on here, if you wanted a office calendar number 11, you would just ask for a nobleman. You put in your request to the telegraph system. But I also noticed in this price list now, you'll see there is a number 12 and a number 13 office count. So these case models did not show up on the Seth Thomas line until the fall of 1888. But looking at a self-winding clock company catalog of the year before, you will see they offered their number 16 and number 18 in these cases. So Seth Thomas was making cases for the self-winding clock company. A year later, they would come out with their office calendar number 12, which again shared the case with the regulator number 9, Seth Thomas did. I don't see as many of the 12s as I do with the 13. And then there's a picture of a number 12. And then there's a number 13, which I've seen quite a few more of those, either in auctions. I had one at one point also. This one was in production for about 26 years. And it's a little bit larger, so the dials were 12 inches instead of 10. So the 9 was a little narrower, the dials were a little bit smaller. Here's a picture again of the Seth Thomas office calendar number 13. The time movement it was the same in both the 12 and the number 13. Again, a bent wire clutch is on this, motion works on the inside. And typically I've seen that the weights were painted on these clocks. There's an example of there painted gold. And again, it would have the Rambleton anchors, a smaller version of the movement that goes in the 12 and 13. So in 1892, Aaron Thomas steps down after 33 years at the helm. While he was president, all the office calendars were introduced that the Seth Thomas Clock Company produced. By this time, there are 8 models in production, and he hands the presidency of the company over to William Thomas Woodruff, which is his sister Martha's son. And again, we can only presume where William Thomas got his middle name. William Woodruff would continue to add new clock models to the Seth Thomas line, porcelain clocks, imitation French crystal clocks, cambours, and others. The 1906-1907 catalog was the last year that the 9, 10, 11, and 12 office calendars were listed. The 1909 catalog, there were only 3 models left, 6, 7, and 13. And by 1913, which was a centennial of the company, may have been the last year that the office calendars were offered, because I didn't see any in a 1916 price list. What you'll see here, you know, this is they had the 7 and 13 were the last 2. In this catalog, there was the only 3 models offered one of their parlor calendars. Incidentally, the parlor number 3 was the one they produced the longest. So William Woodruff served until his death in 1919. At that time, Seth Thomas's great grandson, Seth E. Thomas Jr., would become president. He would be part of the merger with Western Clock Company to create General Time Instruments Corporation in 1931, where he remained as the chairman of the board until he died in 1932. And then that was the end of an era of when Seth Thomas, his sons, grandsons, and stuff were running the clock. I have just a picture here that notes, you know, Seth Thomas still continued for many more years. They transitioned to electric clocks. They did do a few mechanical clocks, usually kind of reproductions like number 2s and so forth. In 1982 was the last year that the Seth Thomas Clock Company was in Thomaston, Connecticut. They did offer that same year this octagon drop calendar. By this time, the movements, I believe, was made in Germany. They were being put into the clocks. They moved their operations to Northwest Georgia until 2001, when they closed down operations. Just a couple of quick pictures at the end of the presentation. There's always some interesting variants. Who made them? I don't know. Some things came out of the factory. This is a model circa the 1860s. It has an office calendar number one style movement, has the early Mix Brothers calendar movement. I thought it was a little interesting. I can't quite see it here, but you can see where they like the movement. It's not working. You can see they had to like etch out a little space for the pendulum because it was hitting the side of the box, so they put it in there. So they had some clearance. This pictures were given to me by a gentleman, Ira Perlich, who wrote an article on this clock in '84 in the Bulletin. I have no idea what this clock is today. This is another interesting variant. This is hanging in the American Clock and Watch Museum. The placard states it's probably a special order or a small test production. I personally can see why they didn't make a lot of these. I don't know if you find this appealing looking, but it doesn't do too much for me. But what is a little off to me, if you look here at the bottom, it has the single Randall T. Andrews, the way the patent date was put on here, where I was talking about where they were printed. But it does not match up with the earlier movements that's in here. So I think, that dial might have been retained later, and they weren't sure which way to retain it, but they had it on there. This clock uses the office calendar number 5 movements and 14-inch dials. Dan Haynes owned this clock and provided me with the information. The case was designed and manufactured by the American Railway and Commercial Advertising Company in Cincinnati, Ohio, and they were in business from 1882 to 1892. These are pictures of several tall case versions, if you want to call it. The one on the left, if you've ever been to the Menger Hotel, which is right next to the Alamo in San Antonio, Texas, or if you're down there and you go to the Alamo, make sure to go over to the Menger Hotel and you'll find this in their lobby. It's a very interesting clock. They say the historian in there that's at the Menger Hotel said that Seth Thomas came when they had their grand opening and stuff. I believe that Seth Thomas came, but it wasn't Daddy Seth Thomas, but he was dead at the time. What's going on? So it was either, it could have been Seth Thomas Jr. or Seth E. Thomas that probably came at the grand opening. The one on the right, let me get it right. So the one on the right is the one that's in the Menger Hotel. The clock on the left is from a private owner in Dallas, Texas. These pictures came from an article that Martha Tips wrote called Texas Best Stats in 1989. And the one in the center was one that just showed up in, again, a bulletin at one point. It's 7.5 feet tall of solid walnut. And, it's a fuzzy picture, but it does have the Randall T. Andrews, assuming movement and dial that's there in the front. So to wrap up, a disclaimer, as I said before, I try to pull all my information that I can from original sources. But I always learning something new. If I come across anything interesting, and not just on Seth Thomas, I do research on perpetual calendar clocks across the board, whether it's Welch and Yale or B.B. Lewis and the Bristol Boys, as I call them, or Ithaca. I would love to talk. So, anybody have any questions? Okay, and if you want afterwards, I can show you the 2 movements, how they changed them, and you can also see them in the dials with the patent dates and the labels too. I can show them through. Oh, and Kathy, just 1 second. Yes.
Yes, and it may be shape. Is that common on all?
So kind of what would you call that?
Could you repeat the question?
So the question was, if the tail on the calendar, right, it has that, I don't know, call it a certain moon shape, crescent, exactly, a crescent shape. I found that almost universal across different calendar clock manufacturers. Now there's a couple variants that you see, but that's the most common that I've seen. Like the Ithaca's definitely had them, and I mean some I see variations, but that's the most common. And again, Seth Thomas and Ithaca were the ones that produced the longest and the most of these perpetual calendar clocks, right? Ithaca was only about 5 years, 6 years behind Seth Thomas in starting production. And they both pushed it right out to, and I think on the hand, there's a handout, have the other ones, I have another one like that. No, it just has the models. I have a similar thing in page 2 for different manufacturers. So it tells you when they started, when they ended, you know, and creating their production calendar. Yes.
Reproduction calendar and date wheels, day wheels, are those available?
So for reproduction calendars for Ithaca, yes. So Joel Warren has made them. There is still the Ithaca Calendar Clock Company. There's a couple owners there that still have parts. I know Joel still has the molds for the large and small, and you know, still has stock of the parts, punching them out. I was recently visited Joel a few weeks ago and trying to make a video that we can show at the American Clock Watch Museum of how they made the calendar movements, because he has, you know, the punches and stuff. So I'm trying to put one together where you can see, you know, punching out the different pieces and then bending them, and then, you know, the frame when it's made, and then the jig, they drill the holes everywhere. And so hopefully we'll have that available on the museum's webpage here in the future. From the Seth Thomas side or any of the other manufacturers, I'm not aware of.
Okay,
You know,
so you have to make your own.
you have to make your own parts. Yeah. And that's pretty much typical for us, right? For any of the clocks that you're working on. Yeah, you can buy springs, but most everything else you have to make it. It's not, I mean, there's some stuff that's out there, where I guess you can work on or number 2 regulator, things like that, catalogs or reproduction parts you can buy, but for the most part, you gotta make them.
Okay.
Yeah. I also have store prices. I forgot. How do we want to award them?
How many guests do we have that just listened to this presentation? You got a red badge on? If you're a guest? You're a guest? Yes.
Well, I think a guest should definitely get one to vote.
That gentleman, I believe, is a yes. Right here. Are you a yes?
You are now. All right. Well, if there are any other questions, I'll be up here for a little while if you want to look at a few things or talk to me about it. And thank you very much for taking the time to listen.